Have you ever felt a chill you can't explain? A whisper in the dark that knows your name? Welcome to a place where the dead don't rest, where steel tables hold secrets and shadows never forget. Tonight, you'll step into 6 cursed morgues, each more terrifying than the last. These aren't just stories, they're nightmares crawling out of the cold, begging to be heard. Stay till the end, if you dare. But beware. Once you look, the morgue looks back. The body wasn't supposed to move. That's what James Carter told himself as he stood frozen in the dim basement morgue of Mercy General Hospital, a crumbling relic of a building in rural Ohio. The flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the steel autopsy table where the corpse lay. A John Doe, pale and rigid, tagged with a tow label that read, "Unidentified male approx. 40. James, a night shift orderly, had seen dozens of bodies in his 6 months here, but none had ever twitched. He blinked hard, chalking it up to exhaustion. Too many double shifts, too much cheap coffee. The air smelled of antiseptic and something sour, metallic. He adjusted his gloves, ready to wheel the body into the cooler when it happened again. The corpse's left hand jerked, sharp, deliberate, like a puppet on a string. James stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. "No way," he muttered, voice trembling. The room felt colder, the hum of the lights louder, as if the morgue itself was waking up. James wasn't a superstitious man. He'd grown up in this sleepy Midwest town, where the biggest scares were crop failures or the occasional bar fight. But Mercy General had a reputation. Whispers of patients who didn't stay dead, of staff who quit after seeing things they couldn't unsee. He'd laughed it off as small-town gossip until now. He edged closer, heart pounding, and leaned over the body. The man's eyes were shut, lips blue, but his fingers, those stiff, pale fingers, curled slowly, like they were testing the air. "What the hell?" James whispered, stepping back again. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, but the signal was dead. Always was down here. The morgue was a concrete tomb, cut off from the world. He glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m., and then back at the body. The hand stopped moving, but now the chest was rising, slow and shallow, like a breath no dead man should take. Panic clawed at him. He grabbed the clipboard from the counter, flipping through the intake forms. John Doe, found, unresponsive in Miller's Field, it read. Pronounced at 11:42 p.m. That was 4 hours ago. James dropped the clipboard, the clatter echoing off the tiles. He needed to call someone. Dr. Ellis, the coroner, anybody, but the landline was upstairs and the body was here between him and the door. Then he heard it, a low, wet rasp, like air leaking from a punctured tire. His eyes snapped to the corpse. The mouth was open now, just a crack, and that sound was coming from it. James backed toward the door, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. The corpse's head turned, slowly, impossibly, until its closed eyes faced him. "You're not real," James stammered, but the rasp grew louder, forming a word. "Stay." He bolted for the door, slamming into it with his shoulder. Locked. The key. He'd left it on the counter. He spun around and the corpse was sitting up now, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes still shut. The toe tag dangled from its foot, swaying as it swung its legs off the table. James screamed, but the sound died in the thick air. The thing stood, joints popping like dry twigs, and shuffled toward him. Its hands reached out, fingers long and cold, brushing the air inches from his face. James pressed himself against the door, fumbling in his pocket for anything, a pen, a coin, but found nothing. The corpse stopped, inches away, and its eyes snapped open, milky, blind, yet staring right through him. "Why?" it rasped, voice like gravel scraping stone. James couldn't answer, couldn't breathe. The thing's hand clamped onto his wrist, ice cold and unyielding. He yanked back, but it held fast, pulling him closer. "You saw," it said, and James felt a jolt. Not just fear, but memory. Miller's Field. He'd been there earlier, driving home, when he'd seen a man staggering in the dark. He'd kept driving, didn't stop, didn't help. Guilt flooded him, sharp and bitter. "I'm sorry," he choked. But the corpse smiled, a thin, terrible smile. "Too late," it said, and its grip tightened. The room spun, the lights dimmed, and James felt his legs give out. He slumped to the floor, the cold seeping into him through him. He woke to darkness, the morgue silent except for his own ragged breathing. The corpse was gone, the table empty. His wrist throbbed, marked with bruises, 5 long fingerprints. He staggered to the counter, grabbed the key, and unlocked the door. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, flickering lights casting shadows that moved when he didn't. James ran, his footsteps echoing, but the rasping voice followed, inside his head now, whispering, "You can't leave." He burst into the lobby, the night sky visible through cracked windows, but the air grew colder, heavier. He reached the exit, yanked the handle, locked. His reflection stared back from the glass, but behind it, 2 milky eyes hovered, unblinking. He pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the town slept. The cold hands found him again, wrapping around his throat this time, squeezing until his vision blurred. "You saw," it hissed, and James knew he'd sealed his fate in that field. When Dr. Ellis arrived at dawn, the morgue was silent. James lay by the exit, pale and still, his neck bruised with fingerprints too long to be human. The autopsy table was empty, the toe tag discarded on the floor. Upstairs, the landline rang unanswered, and outside in Miller's Field, a figure shuffled through the frost, its eyes shut, its hands reaching. The police searched for days, but the John Doe was gone. Mercy General closed a month later, its halls abandoned, its basement locked tight. Locals say they still hear rasping breaths on quiet nights, carried on the wind from the old hospital grounds. James's family buried him in the town cemetery, but his grave is restless. Dirt disturbed, grass flattened, as if something pulls him back to that morgue. Some nights, kids dare each other to sneak past the rusted gates of Mercy General. They don't stay long. One swore he saw 2 figures in the shadows, one limping, one reaching, before he ran, leaving his flashlight behind. The battery was dead when they found it, though it had been new. No one talks about the handprints on the morgue door, too cold, too deep, etched into the steel. Years later, a new orderly, Thomas Reed, took a job at a hospital 50 miles away. His first night, he wheeled a body into the morgue, a Jane Doe found in a ditch. As he turned to leave, he heard a rasp. He froze, eyes on the table. The corpse's hand twitched, and from the shadows a voice whispered, "Stay." Thomas dropped his clipboard, the sound swallowed by the hum of the lights. He didn't run, not yet. He stared, heart hammering as the corpse sat up, its head tilting. Behind it, another figure emerged, taller, limping, its wrist bruised. "You saw," they said together, voices overlapping in a grating chorus. Thomas backed away, but the door slammed shut behind him, locking with no key. The town never learned what happened to Thomas. His car stayed in the lot, keys in the ignition. The morgue was empty by morning, save for a toe tag on the floor. And in Miller's Field, 3 shadows moved now, their hands reaching, their voices rasping through the frost. They say Mercy General's basement still hums at night, a low, hungry sound. The wind carries it across Ohio, a warning no one heeds. And somewhere in the dark, the cold hands wait, patient, relentless, collecting those who see and don't stop, who know and don't speak. If you drive past Miller's Field at night, keep your eyes ahead. Don't look at the shapes in the shadows, don't slow down. Because if you do, you'll hear it. A rasp, a whisper, a plea. Stay. And once you hear it, there's no leaving. Not the morgue, ever. Eleanor Hayes didn't believe in ghosts. Not until the night she heard the whispers in the Savannah morgue, a squat brick building hunched behind the county hospital like a forgotten scar. She'd taken the late shift as a morgue attendant. Easy, Money, she'd thought, for a single mom in Georgia's sticky heat. But at 2 a.m., alone with the dead, something felt wrong. The air was thick, the silence heavy, and then it came, a faint, scratchy murmur from the slab in drawer 3. She froze, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "Hello?" she called, voice cracking in the sterile room. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a pale glow over the steel drawers lining the wall. No answer, except the whisper again, sharper, now like dry leaves scraping stone. Eleanor stepped closer, her sneakers silent on the tiles, and pressed her ear to the drawer. Words formed, soft, insistent. "Let me out." Her heart lurched. She yanked the handle, the drawer sliding open. With a metallic groan, inside lay a woman, mid-30s, pale, eyes closed, tagged as Jane Doe, car accident, 9:15 p.m. Eleanor stared, waiting for movement, but the body was still, too still. She shook her head, muttering, "Get it together," and slid the drawer shut. The whisper returned, louder, angrier. "Let me out." Eleanor stumbled back, her breath shallow. She'd worked here a year, cataloging bodies from bar fights and overdoses, but this was new. Savannah had its ghost stories, haunted squares, weeping statues, but the morgue, that was just death, cold and final. She grabbed her phone, no signal as usual, and glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. The whisper grew, joined by another from drawer 5, then 7. A chorus of voices, overlapping, pleading. She spun around, eyes darting between the drawers. "Who's there?" she demanded, but the whispers turned to scratches, faint at first, then frantic, nails clawing metal from inside. Her skin prickled as she backed toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The lock clicked, trapping her with the dead. Eleanor pounded on the door, screaming, but the hospital was silent above. The scratches grew louder, drawers rattling as if something inside fought to escape. She turned, heart hammering, and saw it, drawer 3 sliding open on its own, inch by inch. The Jane Doe sat up, her head tilting slowly, eyes still shut, lips moving. "You hear us." Terror choked her. She grabbed a scalpel from the counter, clutching it like a lifeline. The woman slid off the slab, her bare feet slapping the floor, movements jerky and wrong. From drawer 5, a man emerged, older, gaunt, tagged John Doe heart failure, his head lolling as he shuffled forward. Drawer 7 groaned open, revealing a teenage girl, her neck bruised from some unseen end. They spoke together. "You hear us." Eleanor swung the scalpel, slashing at the air as they closed in. "Stay back," she shrieked, but they didn't flinch. Their hands reached out, cold, stiff, grasping. She slashed the woman's arm, but no blood came, just a dry, hollow thud. The man's fingers brushed her neck and she felt it. A jolt, a memory not hers. Headlights, a scream. Pavement. She gasped, staggering back. The girl's hand grazed her wrist and another vision hit. Darkness, a rope, choking. "No," Eleanor cried, shaking them off, but the whispers filled her skull. "You hear us. You know us." She dropped the scalpel, hands to her ears, but it didn't stop. The trio circled her, their voices rising, a cacophony of pleas and accusations. Drawer after drawer slid open, more bodies climbing out. Men, women, old, young, all whispering her name. Eleanor. She fell to her knees, sobbing as they pressed closer, their cold fingers tracing her skin. Her memories flooding with theirs. Deaths she'd never lived. Pain she'd never felt. "Why me?" she begged. But the woman leaned in, her lips brushing Eleanor's ear. "You stayed." The realization hit. Every night she'd worked here, every body she'd tagged, she'd listened without knowing. They'd claimed her, piece by piece. She clawed at the floor, desperate for escape, but the whispers tightened around her mind. The man grabbed her arm, his grip iron, and she saw his death, chest seizing, alone in a dark room. The girl's fingers dug into her shoulder and the rope tightened again, her own throat burning. "Stop," she screamed, but the woman's cold hand cupped her face, forcing her to see. Metal crumpling, glass shattering, her own voice fading. Eleanor's mind buckled, fracturing under their weight. She wasn't just hearing them. She was becoming them. Her hands shook as she felt their deaths bleed into her own life slipping away. The room spun, the lights flickered, and the whispers roared. "Stay with us." She collapsed, her body limp, her eyes wide but unseeing. The lights went out, plunging the morgue into black. Eleanor's screams faded into the chorus, swallowed by the dark. When the morning shift arrived, the morgue was empty. No bodies, no Eleanor. Just a scalpel on the floor and scratches inside every drawer, deep and fresh. Weeks later, a new attendant, Thomas Blake, started his shift. At 2 a.m., he heard it. A whisper from drawer 3. "Thomas." He laughed it off, blaming the wind through Savannah's old oaks. But then drawer 5 joined in, then 7, a chorus. "Building, you hear us." He froze, eyes wide, as the scratches began, slow, deliberate, calling. Thomas didn't laugh again. He grabbed his flashlight, shining it on the drawers, but the beam flickered and died. The whispers grew, names he didn't know, Jane, John, Eleanor, twisting into his ears. He backed toward the door, but it slammed shut, the lock clicking, without a touch. Drawer 3 slid open and a pale hand reached out, fingers curling toward him. He screamed, pounding the door, but the hospital slept. The hand grabbed his ankle, cold as the slab, and he fell, dragged toward the drawer. Visions. Hit. Car wrecks, heart attacks, ropes, none his, all theirs. "No!" He choked, kicking free, but more hands emerged, pulling him down. By dawn, Thomas was gone. The morgue stood silent, drawers closed, but the scratches remained. Deeper now, a map of desperation. His flashlight lay by the door. Battery. Dead lens cracked. The morgue never stays quiet long. Locals avoid it now, whispering of voices in the night, of workers who vanish. The drawers gleam under the lights, but inside, something waits. Something that knows your name, that won't let go. They say it's the slabs themselves, alive with the dead, whispering through the steel. A month passed and a third worker, Clara Dunn, took the job. She lasted 2 nights. On the second, she called her sister, voice shaking. "They're talking. To me." The line cut out. Her car was found in the lot, keys inside, but Clara was gone. The county sealed the morgue after that. Boards over the windows, chains on the doors. But kids sneak by at night, daring each other to listen. They hear it. Whispers, scratches, names they know. One boy swore he saw a hand press against the E. Glass from inside, pale and still. Savannah keeps its secrets, but the morgue doesn't. It speaks, it claims, it remembers. And if you hear your name in the dark, run, because the slabs are listening, and they never let go. The coroner's light buzzed like a trapped fly in the basement morgue of Blackwood County Hospital, a sagging brick heap in coastal Maine. Thomas Reed hated that sound. It drilled into his skull every night he worked the graveyard shift. But tonight, October 31st, something else cut through the hum. A low, guttural groan from the steel table under the glaring bulb. Thomas froze, his breath fogging in the chilled air, eyes locked on the body bag. He'd unzipped it an hour ago. Male, late 50s, tagged John Doe hypothermia, found in Pine Hollow. The man's skin was blue-white, lips cracked, eyes shut tight. Thomas had seen worse in his 3 years here, drownings, car wrecks, but this groan wasn't normal. "Hello?" he rasped, voice barely above a whisper. The light flickered, shadows stretching across the tiles. The groan came again, deeper, wetter, like ice cracking underfoot. Thomas stepped closer, his boots squeaking on the damp floor. The body didn't move, no twitch, no breath, but the sound rolled out from its chest, vibrating the table. He leaned in, heart pounding, and saw it, a thin trickle of frost leaking from the man's mouth, curling upward like smoke. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered, jerking back. He grabbed his clipboard, flipping to the intake form. "Found unresponsive at 4 a.m., it read. 8 hours dead. He dropped the clipboard, the clatter swallowed by another groan. Louder, insistent. The frost thickened, spreading across the table, crackling as it crept toward him. Thomas wasn't superstitious. Blackwood was full of old fishermen's tales, but he'd never bought them. Until now. He fumbled for his phone. No bars, not in this concrete pit. The clock read 3:13 a.m., and the groan shifted. Words now garbled, pleading, "See me." The body's head lolled toward him, eyes still closed, frost crusting its lashes. He stumbled to the door, yanking the handle, locked. The key was on the counter, behind the table. "No," he whispered, turning back. The body sat up, slow, stiff, like a marionette with cut strings. Frost spilled from its mouth, pooling on the floor, and its lips moved. "See me," Thomas screamed, pressing against the door as the thing slid off the table, feet dragging, leaving icy streaks. Its hands reached out, fingers brittle and blue, snapping as they flexed. He bolted for the key, slipping on the frost, and grabbed it. The thing lunged, its hand grazing his arm. Cold burned through his sleeve, and he saw it. Pine Hollow, snow. A man staggering, falling, alone. He gasped, wrenching free, and jammed the key into the lock. The door clicked open, but the groan followed, echoing down the hall. "See me." Thomas ran, the cold chasing him, frost spreading up the walls like veins. He burst into the lobby, the night sky black beyond the windows, but the air froze in his lungs. The exit was ahead, but the groan grew. Closer, sharper. He turned, and there it was, shuffling through the hall, frost trailing behind, eyes opening now, white and blind. "You saw," it croaked, voice like splintering ice. Thomas yanked the exit door, locked. His reflection stared back, but behind it, the thing loomed, hands outstretched. He pounded the glass, screaming, but Blackwood slept. The cold wrapped around, his legs pulling him down. "You saw," it repeated, and he felt it. The snow, the dark, the end. His knees buckled, frost creeping up his skin, and the light above dimmed. When the janitor arrived at dawn, Thomas was slumped by the exit, skin blue, breath gone, frost coating his coat. The morgue was empty, the body bag unzipped and bare. The coroner's light buzzed on, casting long shadows over icy streaks on the floor. Days later, the sheriff searched Pine Hollow. No sign of the John Doe. Blackwood whispered of curses, of bodies that wouldn't stay dead. The hospital shut the morgue a week later. Doors bolted, lights off. But on still nights, locals hear it, a groan from beneath the ground carried on the wind. Thomas's sister Clara came looking for answers. She'd heard the rumors, haunted morgues, frozen ghosts, but she needed proof. On November 7th, she broke into the sealed hospital, flashlight trembling in her grip. The air was stale, the silence thick, until she reached the basement stairs. A groan echoed up, low, familiar. "Thomas?" she whispered, descending. The morgue. Door hung ajar, frost rimming the frame. She pushed it open, and the coroner's light flickered on, unplugged but alive. The table gleamed, empty, but frost coated the floor, creeping toward her boots. "See me," a voice groaned, and Clara spun, beam catching a shape in the corner, tall blue, eyes white. She screamed, dropping the flashlight, but it rolled toward the figure, Thomas, or what was left of him. Frost crusted his skin, his mouth leaking icy vapor. "You saw," he croaked, shuffling closer. Clara backed away, but the door slammed shut, frost sealing it tight. "No," she cried, but he grabbed her wrist, cold searing her flesh. She saw it, Pine Hollow, snow, Thomas running, falling, freezing. "You didn't come," he hissed, and guilt stabbed her. She'd ignored his last call, too tired to answer. The frost climbed her arm, her breath icing in her throat. "Stay." He groaned, and another shape rose, the John Doe grinning through frozen lips. Clara fought, clawing at the door, but the cold dragged her down. The light buzzed louder, shadows twisting as more figures emerged, Bodies from Blackwood's past, all groaning, all reaching. "See us!" they chanted, frost swallowing the room. Her screams faded, her body stiffening, eyes frosting over. By morning, the morgue was still again. The light off, the table bare. Clara's flashlight lay frozen to the floor, beam dead. The sheriff found her car outside, keys in the ignition but no tracks led away. Years passed and the hospital rotted, abandoned. Kids dared each other to peek through the cracked windows, swearing they saw frost move, heard groans beneath the earth. One boy, braver than most, snuck inside on Halloween. He didn't come back. His friends found his camera days later, half buried in Pine Hollow. The footage showed the morgue, dark, silent. Then the coroner's light buzzing on, frost spreading, shapes rising. "See us," they groaned, and the boy screamed as hands grabbed him. Thomas, Clara, the John Doe, all frozen, all staring. The tape cut to static, but the audio lingered. A groan, a whisper. "You saw." Blackwood buried the story, but the morgue didn't rest. The light still buzzes on cold nights, unpowered, casting shadows no one dares see. If you walk Pine Hollow, in winter, listen close. The wind carries it, a groan, a plea, a warning. Don't look back. Don't stop. Because beneath the coroner's light, they wait, frozen, watching, hungry for those who see. The morgue in Jasper, Indiana smelled like bleach and rust, a low brick box tucked behind the town's only hospital. James Carter clocked in at midnight, his boots echoing on the cracked linoleum as he headed to the cooler. He'd been a night orderly for 2 years, quiet work, steady pay, but tonight, April 12th, the air felt wrong, heavy with something he couldn't name. Then he heard it, a sharp, shallow breath from drawer 9. James stopped cold, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he called, voice swallowed by the hum of the refrigeration unit. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the steel drawers. No answer, just another breath, ragged and wet, like a drowning man gasping for air. He edged closer, pulse racing, and yanked the drawer open. Inside lay a woman, early 40s, pale, lips tinged blue, tagged Jane Doe, overdose, found 6 p.m. Her chest didn't move, but the breath came again. From her mouth, a faint wheeze that chilled his spine. James slammed the drawer shut, muttering, "Trick of the mind," but it didn't stop. Louder now, echoing from drawer 9. "Help me." He stumbled back, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. Jasper was a dull speck in the Midwest. Cornfields, church suppers, no ghost stories worth telling. But this morgue had rumors, bodies unclaimed, voices in the walls. James had laughed them off until now. He checked his phone, no signal as always, and the clock, 12:47 a.m. The breath spread, drawer. 6, then 4, a chorus of gasps. "Who's doing this?" he shouted, but the breaths turned to words, soft, desperate. "Help us." His flashlight flickered as he spun toward drawer 6. He opened it, male, 60s, John Doe, pneumonia. And the man's lips parted, a breath hissing, out, eyes shut tight. James slammed it closed, but drawer 4 slid open on its own. A teenage boy, accident, whispering, "Help." James bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge, locked from outside. "No," he yelled, pounding the steel, as the breaths grew louder, faster, a symphony of need. Drawer 9 rattled, then burst open, the Jane Doe sitting up, head tilted, eyes still closed. "You hear?" she wheezed, voice like air through a broken pipe. He grabbed a broom from the corner, swinging it at her, but she didn't flinch. Her hand shot out, cold fingers brushing his wrist. A jolt hit him, darkness, pills, a bathroom floor. "Help me," she rasped, and he yanked free, staggering back. Drawer 6 opened again, the old man rising, chest heaving with shallow gasps. "You hear?" James swung the broom, knocking him down. But the boy from drawer 4 was up now, stumbling forward, whispering, "Help us." Their hands reached, cold and stiff, brushing his skin. More visions, lungs failing, metal twisting, blood. "Stop!" he screamed, but the breaths filled the room, a suffocating roar. Every drawer shuddered, sliding open, one by one, then all at once. Bodies climbed out, men, women, young, old, all unclaimed, all gasping, all chanting, "You hear us!" James fell to his knees, hands over his ears, but the sound burrowed in. Their deaths, their pleas, their pain. "Why me?" he sobbed, and the Jane Doe knelt before him, her cold hand on his cheek. "You stayed," she wheezed, and he saw it. Every shift he'd worked, every tag he'd written, he'd breathed with them. They'd waited, unclaimed, for him. The lights flickered out, the room a void of gasps. James's screams drowned in their chorus, his breath stolen as they pulled him down. When the morning crew arrived, the morgue was silent. Drawers shut, bodies still, James gone. Just a broom snapped in half on the floor. Weeks later, a new orderly, Clara Dunn, took the shift. At 1 a.m. she heard it, a breath from drawer 9. "Clara." She froze, chalking it up to fatigue, but then drawer 6 joined in. Then 4, whispering, "Help us." She dropped her clipboard, the sound lost in the rising gasps. Clara didn't run, not yet. She shone her flashlight on drawer 9 and it slid open, a woman staring with shut eyes, breathing, "You hear?" Clara backed away, but the door slammed shut, locking her in. The breaths surged, hands reaching from every drawer, cold and desperate. She fought, kicking at the hands, but they grabbed her. Visions of overdoses, crashes, lungs failing. "No!" she screamed. But the woman from drawer 9 loomed over her. "You stayed." The gasp swallowed her, pulling her into the dark. By dawn, Clara was gone. The morgue stood still, drawers closed, but the air hummed with faint breaths. Her flashlight lay by the door, dead, lens fogged with frost. Jasper hushed it up, but the morgue didn't sleep. Locals avoid it now, swearing they hear gasps on quiet nights, see shadows behind the blinds. The unclaimed weight, breathing through the steel, calling for those who stay. A month later, a third worker, Henry Tate, started his shift. He'd heard the whispers, crazy talk, he'd thought. But at 2 a.m., a breath hissed from drawer 9. "Henry." He laughed, nerves jangling, but then drawer 6 rasped, then 4. A chorus building. "Help us." His flashlight shook as he approached, and drawer 9 slid open. A woman, lips moving. "You hear?" Henry didn't laugh again. He swung his flashlight like a club, but the beam died as hands reached from the dark, cold, grasping, pulling. Visions hit, pills, wrecks, suffocation, and he screamed, "I don't know you." But the woman whispered, "You stayed," and the breaths dragged him down. By morning, Henry was gone, drawers shut, air thick with gasps, his flashlight cracked on the floor. The hospital boarded up the morgue that week, locks rusted, windows dark. But kids sneak close, daring each other to listen. They hear it. Breaths, faint and endless, names they know. One girl, braver than most, pressed her ear to the wall. She ran home, pale, swearing she heard Ellen, her own name, mixed with the gasps. Her parents found her window open that night, frost on the sill. Ellen gone. Jasper doesn't talk about it, but the morgue breathes on. The unclaimed linger, their gasps seeping through the cracks, waiting for the next to stay. If you pass by, at night, don't stop, don't listen, because once you hear them, they won't let you go. The morgue in Carthage, Mississippi was a cinder-block tomb, its steel table glinting under a single bulb that swayed in the humid night. Eleanor Hayes wiped sweat from her brow, her orderly shift dragging past midnight on June 23rd. She'd worked here a year, quiet hours, good for a widow with bills. But tonight the shadows moved wrong, stretching too long across the tiles. Then she saw it, a flicker on the table, like a figure standing where no body lay. Eleanor blinked, her flashlight steady in her grip. "Who's there?" she called, voice sharp in the still air. The bulb buzzed, casting jagged edges on the empty slab. No answer, just a shadow shifting, tall and thin, sliding toward the wall. She stepped closer, heart thudding and the shadow stretched higher, arms bending where no joints should be. "I see you," she muttered, but it vanished. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth. Eleanor checked the log. 3 bodies in the cooler, none on the table tonight. She'd prepped a John Doe earlier, 50s, heart attack, found 8 p.m., but he was tagged and stored. Still, the shadow returned, darker now, pooling on the steel like ink. A whisper followed, low, guttural. "Look at me." She spun, flashlight sweeping the room, but the walls were bare. Carthage had its tales, swamp spirits, old graves, but the morgue was just concrete and death. Eleanor shook it off, grabbing her phone, no signal, typical down here, and glanced at the clock. 1:13 a.m. The shadow flared again, splitting into 2, then 3, whispering in unison, "Look." Her breath hitched. She backed toward the cooler, but the door slammed shut behind her, locking with a click. "No," she hissed, pounding it as the shadows grew, rising from the table, featureless but alive. The bulb flickered, and one shadow lunged, brushing her arm, cold, sharp, and she saw it. A man clutching his chest, collapsing in the dark. Eleanor screamed, swinging her flashlight, but it passed through the shadow, the beam dimming. Another shadow rose, shorter, hunched. A woman she'd tagged last week. Drowning, riverbank. "Look at me," it rasped, and her fingers grazed Eleanor's. Neck wet, choking, a river rushing in her mind. "Stop!" she yelled, but a third shadow joined. Young, jagged, car wreck, and touched her leg. Metal screamed, glass shattered. The room spun, shadows multiplying, climbing the walls, their whispers a chorus. "Look at us." Eleanor stumbled to the table, gripping its edge, but the steel burned cold, shadows seeping from it, wrapping her wrists. "No," she cried, pulling free, but they pressed closer, their touches flooding her. Deaths she'd logged, bodies she'd seen. "Why me?" she gasped, and the first shadow loomed, faceless but clear. You watched. The truth sank in. Every shift, every tag, she'd stared into their ends, feeding the shadows with her gaze. The bulb burst, plunging the morgue into black, their whispers deafening. "Stay." Eleanor's screams faded, swallowed by the dark. When the janitor arrived at dawn, the morgue was empty. Table bare, cooler sealed, Eleanor gone, just a flashlight rolling on the floor, its light dead. Weeks later, a new worker, Thomas Reed, took the shift. At 1 a.m., he saw it. A shadow, on the table, whispering, "Thomas." He laughed it off, heat playing tricks. But then 2 more rose, rasping, "Look at us." His flashlight flickered as the door slammed shut, locking him in. Thomas swung at them, but they closed in, their touches cold, heart-stopping, water-filling, metal-crushing. "No," he shouted, but the shadows whispered, "You watched," and the steel table pulsed beneath him, alive with their weight. By morning, Thomas was gone, the morgue still, shadows etched into the steel. Carthage hushed it up, but the morgue didn't rest. Locals avoid it now, swearing the bulb sways on windless nights, shadows dancing where no one stands. The table waits, cold and hungry, for those who look too long. The silence after Eleanor's shift wasn't peace. It was a held breath, the morgue crouching like a beast in wait. She'd left her thermos behind, half full of coffee, and the janitor, Amos Bell, found it that morning, still warm despite the chill. He'd worked nights in Carthage for decades, seen floods, storms, bodies, but never this. The steel table gleamed too bright, shadows curling at its edges like smoke. Amos grunted, mop in hand, and muttered, "Ain't right." He'd heard the whispers. Old folks said the morgue sat on a sunken graveyard, slaves buried deep when the swamp took the land. He shook it off, but then the bulb flickered, and a shadow rose, broad, heavy, faceless, whispering, "Amos." He dropped the mop, heart hammering as the shadow stretched, fingers clawing the air. "Who's that?" he barked, voice rough from years of cigarettes. No answer, just a second shadow, slimmer, joining it, then a third, their whispers layering. "Look at us." The air turned sour, thick with rot, and Amos stumbled back, his boot catching Eleanor's thermos. It tipped, coffee spilling across the tiles, and the shadows surged, pooling in the liquid like oil. He saw it then, a flash in the spill, a man choking on mud, hands clawing at the earth. "Lord!" Amos gasped, but another shadow lunged, brushing his arm, cold, wet, a scream trapped in his throat as he felt chains bite his wrists. The bulb buzzed louder, shadows climbing the walls, their forms sharpening. Men, women, bent and broken, eyes hollow. "You watched," they hissed. And Amos knew. They weren't the bodies he'd swept past, but the ones beneath, forgotten in the swamp. He'd cleaned this place too long, felt their weight too often. He bolted for the door, but it slammed shut, lock clicking like a gunshot. "No!" he roared, pounding it as the shadows closed in, their touches burning, mud in his lungs, iron on his skin. The steel table pulsed, a heartbeat under his feet, and one shadow pressed his chest. Suffocation, slow and deep. Amos clawed at his shirt, gasping, but the shadows pinned him, dragging him to the table. "Look!" they chanted, and he did. Saw faces in the steel, Eleanor's among them, eyes wide, mouth open. "No!" he screamed, but the bulb shattered. Glass raining and darkness took him. By noon, the morgue was silent again. Amos gone, mop abandoned, coffee dried in streaks. The sheriff, Clara Dunn, came looking, her boots echoing in the empty hall. She'd grown up here, knew the tales, swamp, took what it wanted, but this was new. The table glinted, shadows faint but there, whispering, "Clara." She drew her gun, voice steady. "Show yourself." The shadows flared, 3 now, then 5, rising from the steel like mist. "Look at us," they rasped, and she fired. Bullets, punched the wall, useless. A shadow touched her, cold, deep, a weight crushing her chest. Clara staggered, gun slipping as another grazed her, water in her throat choking her breath. "You watched," they said, and she saw it. Every case she'd closed, every body she'd signed off on, feeding this hunger. The table trembled, shadows wrapping her legs, pulling her down. She screamed, clawing at the steel, but they pressed harder, their whispers a roar. "Stay." The door rattled but didn't budge, and Clara's gun clattered away, useless. Shadows swallowed her, and the morgue went still once more. The town hushed it up, but the morgue didn't sleep. A kid, James Tate, snuck in weeks later, daring his luck. He saw the table, shadows rising, whispering, "James." He ran, but his cap stayed behind, cold on the floor. The morgue in Harrow, Illinois, squatted beneath the town's hospital, a concrete crypt lit by flickering tubes that buzzed like dying flies. Clara Dunn punched in at 11 p.m., her orderly shift starting under a moonless September sky. She'd taken the job for the quiet. Solitude suited her, but tonight the silence cracked with a sound she couldn't place, a faint tap, sharp and steady from the autopsy room. Clara paused, her clipboard tight in her hands. "Hello?" she called, voice echoing off the tiles. The lights hummed, casting a pale sheen on the steel table. Empty, she'd checked an hour ago. The tap came again, louder, rhythmic, like fingernails, on metal. She stepped closer, pulse quickening, and saw it, a smudge on the table, dark and wet, spreading like a stain. "What the hell?" she muttered, leaning in. The smudge moved, slowly, deliberately, forming letters. "I remember." Clara jerked back, her breath catching as the tap grew frantic, echoing from the walls. She'd worked here 6 months, logged bodies, cleaned tables. But this was new. Harrow whispered of the morgue. Folks said it held onto the dead. But Clara didn't believe in ghosts. She grabbed her phone, no signal, never was down here, and checked the clock. 11:47 p.m. The tapping spread, cooler doors, cabinets, the floor, a chorus of unseen hands. She spun, flashlight trembling, and the smudge shifted again. You saw. Her skin prickled as the lights dimmed, shadows twisting on the table. Clara backed toward the exit, but the door slammed shut, the lock clicking without a key. No, she yelled, pounding it as the tapping turned to scratches, deep, grating, like claws on steel. The table shuddered, the stain bleeding into words. I know you. She froze, heart hammering, as a shadow rose from the smudge, tall, faceless, reaching. She swung her flashlight, the beam cutting through it, but it reformed, whispering, Clara. Her name chilled her blood. The cooler doors rattled, one creaking open. A Jane Doe, stabbed 3 days ago. Her shadow joining the first, tapping the floor. You saw me. Clara stumbled back, but another door groaned. John Doe. Overdose. His shadow rising, scratching. You touched me. The room filled with them. Shadows from every body she'd logged, every tag she'd written, tapping, scratching, whispering her name. Stop, she screamed, but the table pulsed, the stain scrawling. You stayed. She swung again, but they closed in, cold fingers brushing her, knives piercing, veins burning, deaths she'd cataloged. Why me? She sobbed, and the first shadow loomed, its voice a hiss. You remembered. The truth hit. Every shift, every face, she'd carried them in her mind, feeding the morgue's memory. She clawed at the table, desperate, but the steel burned cold, the stain rewriting. I own you. The shadows tightened, their scratches a cacophony, pulling her down. Her flashlight dropped, rolling, its beam catching faces, pale, eyeless, hers, among them. No, she choked. But the lights died, the room a void of taps and whispers. Stay with us. Clara's screams faded, swallowed by the dark, her body sinking into the morgue's grip. When the morning shift arrived, the morgue was silent, table clean, doors shut, Clara gone, just a clipboard cracked on the floor stained with I remember. The crew searched, found nothing, but the air hummed with faint taps, a rhythm no one could trace. Weeks later, James Carter took the job. At midnight, he heard it, a tap from the table. James. He shrugged it off. Old pipes. But the stain appeared. You saw. The tapping grew, cooler doors creaking, shadows rising, whispering, you touched. He bolted, but the exit locked, the table scrawling. I know you. James fought, kicking at the shadows, but they swarmed. Gunshots, falls, poison, all he'd logged. No, he yelled, but the stain bled. You stayed. The shadows dragged him, down, the table pulsing, his screams fading into scratches. By dawn, James was gone, the morgue still, shadows etched into the steel, his pen snapped beside, I own. Harrow buried it, but the morgue didn't forget. Locals shun it now, hearing taps on still nights, seeing stains through the windows. The hospital tried to sell it, but buyers fled. One swore he saw help scratched on the table before the deal closed. A month on, Eleanor Hayes started her shift. At 1 a.m., the tap came. Eleanor. And the stain wrote, I remember. She froze, flashlight shaking as shadows rose, whispering, You saw. The door locked, the table pulsed, and they closed in. Drownings, crashes, her own hands on their tags. I didn't mean to, she cried, but the stain replied, You stayed. Eleanor screamed, clawing at the door, but the shadows wrapped her. Suffocation, blood, her own memories twisting. The morgue swallowed her, leaving nothing, table bare, air thick with taps. Her flashlight lay shattered, stained with I know, its lens cracked like a scream. The hospital sealed the morgue, boards over doors, locks rusted shut, but kids creep near, daring each other to listen. They hear it, taps, scratches, names they know. One girl, Mary, swore she saw Mary on the window in wet streaks. She vanished, That night, her shoe left by the morgue, sole scratched with "You saw." Years passed, and the morgue festered, its silence a lie. Thomas Reed, a rookie cop, got a call. Kids missing near the hospital. On October 13th, he pried the boards loose, flashlight cutting through the dust. The air was stale, thick, until the tap started. Thomas, sharp against the table. He froze, gun drawn, as the stain bled. I remember. Shadows rose, tall, bent, clawing, whispering. You saw. Thomas backed away, but the door slammed, board snapping shut. The table pulsed, writing, "You stayed." He fired, bullets vanishing into the dark, but the shadows swarmed. Burns, blades, falls, all cases he'd read, bodies he'd found. "I didn't," he shouted, but they hissed. "You knew." The morgue tightened, scratches carving the walls, the stains screaming, "I know you." Thomas fell, flashlight rolling, its beam catching faces, Clara, James, Eleanor, etched in the steel. His gun clattered, useless, as the taps drowned him, the morgue claiming him whole. By dawn, Thomas was gone, table blank, air still, his badge bent on the floor, stained with "You saw." The sheriff sealed it tighter, chains, concrete, but the taps leaked out, whispers curling through Harrow like fog. Kids don't go near anymore, but some hear it. Taps at night, names on the wind. One man, drunk and bold, broke in last spring, chasing a dare. His friends found his coat outside, stained with "I remember," his voice lost to the dark. The morgue doesn't sleep. Its table writes, its shadows tap, its memory endless. A nurse, Ellen Price, walked past one dusk, hearing Ellen scratched in the air. She ran, but her keys fell, later found by the morgue, bent with "You stayed." Harrow crumbles, but the morgue thrives, its taps a heartbeat, its stains a voice. If you pass at dusk, don't stop, don't look, because it knows you and it won't forget. The dead linger there, etched in steel, tapping for those who remember. Last winter, a janitor, Henry Tate, swept the hospital lot, too close to the morgue. He heard Henry in the wind, saw the stain through a crack. "I remember." He dropped his broom, ran, but his cap stayed, found days later, scratched with "You saw." The morgue waits, its memory a trap, every touch, every glance, a thread it weaves. Harrow fades, but the taps grow, the stains deepen and the shadows reach. Patient, endless, alive. If you hear your name in Harrow, don't turn, don't answer, because the morgue remembers you, and it keeps what it knows. The table waits, the steel whispers, and the dead tap, forever for you. You've heard their whispers, felt their cold grip. Now the morgue knows you too. Escape the curse by subscribing to Mysteries Beyond Death, smashing that like button and ringing the bell so you never miss a nightmare. Leave a comment with your name below. Dare the shadows to remember you. Don't let them pull you under yet.